So this is going to be talking about a map of the Kilauea Caldera, and this is so I'm at the National Park Service in Harpers Ferry Center, and one of the things we do there is these brochures you get when you go to a national park, any national park around the country. So because of some of the activity in 2018 at this caldera, there was a need to update this map that Tom made. So this is some kind of before and after of what happened there, and I am not an expert in volcanology, so I'm just going to read something. In 2018, a new eruption of the Kilauea volcano changed the island of Hawaii forever. From May through August, large lava flows covered land southeast of the park, destroying over 700 homes and devastating residential areas. At the same time, the summit area of the park was dramatically changed by tens of thousands of earthquakes, towering ash plumes, and a massive collapse of the Kilauea Caldera. So there were things happening all over the island, but the part I'm focusing on is the Kilauea Caldera, which is here is a before and after. On the left, you can see, there's lava in the crater there, and that drained when this all happened, so there is no lava anymore, and the crater through the eruptions got much larger and steeper and deeper. So there's just some of the ash plumes coming out of that crater. So this is the old map. So this is a side of this brochure, and the Kilauea Caldera inset is in the upper right, so that's what I'm talking about here. And so these maps were all made by Tom, and many years ago using software that I can't update anymore. So even if I could update the vector, which I could update the vector information on top, in that Kilauea Caldera map, there were so many changes to the crater that it just kind of needed to be rebuilt. So I am in this interesting position of replacing Tom's maps. So yes, if you have a problem with that, talk to Tom. He's the one that retired. So my workflow, it was pretty standard with this, going into Natural Scene Designer, starting in Natural Scene Designer and then going into Photoshop and then doing the vector in Illustrator. So in Natural Scene Designer, the data was this is a heavily studied area. There was a Hawaii Volcano Observatory actually on the rim that isn't there anymore, or isn't open anymore anyway. And so the USGS was collecting new LIDAR data and new imagery and just sent it to me. So I didn't even have to do any of the work of going out and finding the data. So I brought it all into Natural Scene Designer and found a viewpoint, lighting angle, all that, could see what all my data looked like. So on this next slide, it's just sort of a preliminary view. I'm working within the boundary, the extent of the map that was on the brochure. We weren't doing a complete redesign of the brochure. So in some ways that made it easier because I was going to use the extent that Tom already had set up. So I brought in the roads and the trails just to see what it looked like. And I think what's interesting here, because this is the new LIDAR data, you can see the green trails going actually into the crater now. And that is not something you can do. This is not on the final map. Don't do that. But it made me realize how many changes actually happened here. So then one of my first renders was this, which doesn't look that great, but when I saw it, I knew I had something to work with. It's quite dark, so then I'll just sort of quickly go through some of the changes I made from there. I definitely downsampled the LIDAR data because it was really high res and I didn't need it to be super high resolution, and the imagery. Adjusted the color and brightness. Here I'm doing this in Photoshop with lots of different layers, which I'll show you in a minute. And so using different sort of Photoshop effects, hue, saturation, brightness, contrast, levels, curves, lots of stuff. Did some color selection, like specific color adjustments to bring out the forest. In the previous one, the forest is a little dark. Make the forest a little more green because it should be green. There are lots of things on top of each other. There are many years of lava flows here that have happened over the past century and before. And there's vegetation, so I thought it looked a little flat, so I did some special selections in Photoshop to sort of put those lava flows on top of each other and put the vegetation on top of each other, just to give it, and I had to zoom in here to see it because it didn't show on the whole map. So this, it's looking a little flat if you look at the forest and lava in the bottom part of the image. And then doing some beveling and embossing with specific selections, I think brought that out a little bit. And so then I'm here with everything I've done so far. This is great. You know, I'm thinking this is looking okay, but I need to put vector on top of it, and I need to put type on top of it. And anybody that's made any shaded relief or using imagery gets to a point where then you just have to lighten it. So then I lightened it. At this point, I think I actually showed it to Tom, and he's like, you need to use a height mask to sort of darken the crater, lighten everything else. So I added something like that to sort of give it some depth. So this height mask is something that's just created in Natural Scene Designer and brought into Photoshop and used as a layer. As I'm looking over the map, I'm noticing a lot of artifacts from the rendering. If you can see around that small crater there is some purple, just not sure where it came out, but these were actually in a number of places. So I just used Photoshop to sort of brush those out. I probably used the Wacom tablet and a pen and just did some sampling and fixed those throughout the map. And then I used a common tactic we use when we have to put type on top of here and did these very soft type halos. And there's been a couple tutorials out there. Tom, I believe, has one, and others. So they're very noticeable here, but then when you put the type on it, you'll see in a minute that they're not as noticeable. So I originally wasn't going to show this because when I was putting this presentation together over the past couple weeks, I was kind of cringing at all the layers I have here. But after hearing some other people talk, I'm like, I should at least show it. So if you want, you can pause this video later and when you're watching it and look at my crazy layers. So there's the final map. Just throw in the vector data, labels, icons, everything else. Comparing it to the old map, previously the crater rim drive went all the way around the caldera. I don't think you could drive it, but you could hike it, and that's no longer there. There's no trails inside of the caldera. There's lots of changes. There's lots of changes currently happening too. They're constantly opening trails and opening new areas as things happen. And so so the overall brochure did not change a lot, but there were some changes to actually all three of these maps, and the biggest change being to the Kilauea Caldera map in the upper right. So since then, the map is already out of date. I did this in the winter, spring of this past year, and because of how long it takes to get printed and get to the park, I believe it only got there a month or two ago. And there have already been lots of changes. There's more crumbling of the crater walls, and now there is a lake forming in the bottom. And it is actually rising. What do I have here? It's rising 6 inches a day. I believe the water is very warm. And so it keeps getting bigger, and scale is difficult in this picture. It looks like, there's some trees in the background, but scale is really hard. So this surface area of this pond now is over the size of a football field. So then they decided to Photoshop the Aloha Stadium in there, which I thought was awesome. So this is a very large, I believe, 50,000 person capacity stadium in Honolulu, and it just gives you an idea of how big this crater is. And that's all. Mahalo. Thank you.